Hello there.
What a political move to stick two fingers up at Suella Braverman.
Politics at Jack and Sam's is the podcast where we tell you what's going to happen next week in the wild world of Westminster.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and with me, as always, is the great Sam Coates of Sky News.
Keeping you ahead of the political agenda.
One top civil servant said to me they're 70-30 in favour of thinking something will happen as soon as Monday.
Sam, is it going to happen, yes or no?
Listen to Politics at Jack and Sam's wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, I'm Rob Powell, bringing you an extra episode of the Sky News Daily because on Saturday night, Iran launched its first ever direct attack on Israel. Now, Iran says hundreds of drones and missiles were sent in retaliation for an attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria earlier this month, which killed 2 generals and several members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Now, in the end, 99% of the missiles and drones launched on Saturday night were intercepted, according to the Israeli Defence Force, but the threat of escalation still hangs over the Middle East, as Iran warns of further potential attacks if Israel retaliates, and Benjamin Netanyahu pledges to do whatever is necessary to defend his country. I'm here with Sky's international editor, Dominic Waghorn. Hi, Dom.
Hi, Rob.
Now, we'll get on to the sort of broader threat of escalation and the broader diplomatic response in a minute, but can you just take us through how this attack actually came about and what relevance, if anything, does the ongoing conflict in Gaza have into this?
Yeah, well, this is a major escalation in the war in the Middle East, but it's obviously not the first. In recent times, the most significant escalation was that massacre on October the 7th when Hamas and other groups broke out of the Gaza enclave and massacred more Jews than have been killed since the Second World War in one day. And then there was another major escalation after months of war in Gaza when Israel presumes to have attacked the consulate building of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, killing 13 Iranians, a number of them high-level commanders and generals. Now, Israel hasn't claimed responsibility, so it's not explained the rationale for that attack. But ever since then, the Iranians decided and have made clear that they will retaliate. The Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, twice said that Israel must be punished and will be. Western countries, Arab countries, countries in the region have been trying to restrain Iran, but it went ahead with this attack, which I think surprised many people in terms of the fact that it was a direct attack and the scale of the attack. There's been a shadow war between the two countries for years now, but it's the first time that Iran has directly attacked Israel. So a significant development, and obviously the question now, what does it lead to?
A majority of those drones and missiles were brought down last night. Can you talk us through practically how Israel and its allies did that?
Yeah, and I think the Israelis will present this as a major win, and it was a significant military achievement. I think, the figures are 350 missiles or projectiles of various forms, so amongst them were drones. Amongst those would have been the Shahed drones that we've seen Russia buy off Iran and use against the Ukrainians. But also we saw cruise missiles being fired. So that's a significant development, not just the fact that Iran was directly attacking Israel for the first time, but using cruise missiles to do so. And according to the Israelis, only a few got through, and some of them got through to Netivim, the airbase, which is where the attack on the embassy on April the 1st was launched from. Now, the Iranians are making a great deal of that, saying a huge amount of damage was done there. The Israelis are saying there wasn't a lot of damage. And I think for the Israelis, the consolation in this, although it will be deeply worrying for Israelis that their arch enemy has finally attacked them, the consolation is that their air defences and their air force prevailed. But also they were supported in what was a combined effort by Western air forces, Western militaries, but also Arab militaries as well. And I think in the run-up to this, the West has been saying to Israel, we'll have your back. We will defend you against whatever Iran throws at you. But I suspect there's been a kind of quid pro quo in that, which is that we will do this on the understanding you don't escalate things and make matters worse. And we'll now see whether Israel honours that promise if they made it or decides to ignore it for reasons of their own national security.
We, of course, saw UK involvement last night as well. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has confirmed that the RAF did shoot down a number of Iranian attack drones. It's interesting because initially the MOD were briefing that jets were dispatched under a separate operation to combat Islamic State, that the jets only flew over Iraq and Syria, but crucially they were authorised to shoot down Iranian drones if they needed to. Clearly that situation did arise last night. Dominic, we've seen in the past the UK participate in strikes against Iranian proxies, the Houthi rebels, things like that. How much does it raise the stakes that you now literally have RAF aircraft shooting down Iranian assets?
I think it's significant in the sense that it makes it very clear to Iran that any more attacks like this will be dealt with as a combined effort by Israel and its allies. And I think the worrying thing is it kind of draws a dividing line between the West and Israel and its allies and Iran, should this escalate into a bigger regional war. But I think the worrying thing for Iran will be that it seems a number of Arab nations also shot these projectiles and drones down as they went through their skies, so effectively defending Israel. Iran projects itself as a kind of champion of the Islamist cause, but as the Shia power in the region, that claim is very much resented and challenged by Sunni nations, and particularly Saudi Arabia. And I think anything that kind of deepens the chasm between the two sides on these sort of fault lines that run through the Middle East is potentially dangerous if this leads to any sort of expanding or deeper conflict in the Middle East.
In terms of the Israeli response to what we saw last night, as we sit here early Sunday afternoon, it's difficult to know, I guess, events moving very quickly. But as of now, do you think that some sort of military response is inevitable, given the unprecedented nature of what we saw last night? And what form could that take? Or could Israel decide that it doesn't want to respond, that it wants to step back, essentially?
On the balance of what I know of Israel, having lived there and observed it for a long time now, I think it's probable that they will retaliate in some shape or form. We don't know what's being said diplomatically behind the scenes, but I think it's fair to assume that Israel's going to be coming under a lot of pressure from Britain, from European allies, and particularly from America, to call it a day, to draw a line under this. And Joe Biden reportedly said to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night, take this as a win, bank it. You know, you've hit the consulate, you have proved that you can defend Israel, let's just stop it there. And the Iranians have said, publicly at least, they've declared the affair concluded. Now, I think the Israelis are sceptical about that, so a certain amount will depend on whether Iran launches more attacks or maybe attacks through proxies, which will give them a level of deniability. And I think probably have to ask ourselves, I mean, Israelis are very fond of saying to foreigners, how would you deal with this if it was happening to you? How would we feel if Iran or another hostile nation that called us Little Satan? How would we feel here if we came under attack by 350 missiles and drones and cruise missiles by a hostile nation like that? Would there be a political appetite to call it a day, to restrain, or would there be real pressure on the government to respond? And I suspect that the Israelis the government will feel they need to do more to push back. Now, they could possibly strike IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps assets outside of Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon and other places, or they could attack Iranian proxies. And that, I think, could sort of be a escalation, if you pardon the kind of oxymoron. So it would be an escalation or retaliation, but it would slowly diffuse the situation. If they strike targets in Iran, Iran will feel it has to strike back, and then we could be in a very dangerous situation.
OK, let's pause there for a minute. When we come back, we'll look at the broader diplomatic picture and whether this could lead to a wider conflict in the Middle East. OK, I'm still here with our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. Dom, a lot of leaders today are talking a lot about de-escalating and the risk of a wider conflict, a wider escalation. What practically does that look like? And is it possible that it drags in Western allies of Israel like the UK and the US?
The nightmare scenario is Israel strikes back, hits a number of targets inside Iran. Iran's air defences are no match for Israeli jets, who have a long-range capability and would be well able to penetrate Iranian air defences. If they struck somewhere with a high population or a number of military were killed, the Iranians could strike back. They may choose to do so by upping the ante, by drawing in Hezbollah, who have 150,000 missiles in the hills of southern Lebanon, according to the Israelis and Western intelligence. If they fired some of those, then it could turn into a much hotter war in Israel than we've seen so far in Gaza. There is the possibility also of Iran deciding to strike Gulf nations over the Persian Gulf, even to attack American military assets based in some of those Gulf nations, although that is unlikely. But you can see how one retaliation could lead to another. And I think often we talk in terms of sort of diplomatic posturing and the power of deterrence. These are quite dry terms, but war is a kinetic, unpredictable, it's not a science, and you can see how one thing can lead to another. And it could end up ultimately in the region being engulfed in a much wider conflict. And for that reason, understandably, there's a huge amount of diplomatic pressure frantically going on to try and calm things down, cool heads, and step back from the brink.
How much of that diplomatic pressure is done through sort of carrot, I guess, and how much is done through stick? Is there a sense that you could see sort of conditions hinted at for ongoing Western support, as we saw last night from the US and UK, if you get an Israeli response which is perceived as escalating the situation? Or is that something that the US especially would just go nowhere near? Is it mainly down to kind of dialogue and persuasion?
Well, I think in terms of America's support for Israel, the reason Joe Biden has said it's ironclad, even though he's had a lot of differences with Netanyahu over the way the war in Gaza has been fought, the reason for that is that Joe Biden is an unquestionably supportive believer in Israel, but also he knows that if there's any doubt about America's military support for Israel, that is dangerous for the stability of the region because it could embolden Israel's enemies. So I think there's clear reason for that, and that will continue. But you have to wonder, you have to speculate as to what's going on at the moment. And I think, diplomacy is a process of negotiating. That it's possible that Benjamin Netanyahu might be saying to the Americans, I am being told and I'm being pressured both publicly but also by my commanders and the members of my coalition to react to this. I have to, for Israel's sake, for our pride and our prestige and our national security. But if you take the brakes off in terms of your criticism of the way we're fighting in Gaza, if you let me go ahead with an offensive in Rafah, if you ease that pressure on me that you've put me under as part of the Gaza conflict, then I will step back from attacking Iran. Now, that is purely speculative, but I think there will be a negotiating process going on here. Exactly what shape or form that will take, I don't know, but I think that there is a limit to how much support America will give in an ironclad sense to Israel, and what they've made very clear is that if Israel retaliates against Iran, it'll be on its own. But in terms of how Israel then defends a further retaliation from Iran, America will almost undoubtedly step in, as will Israel's allies, to defend it.
What is the relevance and the importance of other Arab states in the region? We saw yesterday countries like Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon closing their airspace. How will Iran's attack be received by them, especially sort of set against the context of recent years seeing a kind of normalisation between Israel and some Arab states in the region? Yeah,
we've seen a process of normalisation where former enemies of Israel, like Saudi Arabia, have started normalising relations. So that was begun under the Abraham Accords by the UAE and other Gulf nations, and Saudi Arabia has made it pretty clear it wants to join in. Shortly before this happened, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said that every day brought Saudi Arabia closer to normalising relations with Israel, and that obviously was anathema to the ears of the mullahs and the clerics in Tehran, but also to their allies like Hamas, because it would be leaving the Palestinians out in the cold in the minds of Hamas, and it would be weakening Iran's control and influence in the region. And that is why many people believe Hamas launched its attack, fearful of being left out of the process, being ostracised and marginalised as part of a normalisation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's part of the equation. It's important also to say that Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, are enemies of Iran. They have had a kind of diplomatic rapprochement, but there's no love lost between them, and they resent Iran's overbearing presence and efforts to project its power around the region. So there's no love lost there, and they haven't given a huge amount of support to Hamas, as you can imagine, during this war. But in terms of what happened last night, I don't think we'll really know for sure ever exactly how much support was given to Israel to defend itself. I think they'll present themselves, the Jordanians have already, saying they were shooting down unidentified objects entering their airspace, and they felt they had to do so to defend their airspace. But clearly they were rallying around Israel to a certain extent, defending Israel and doing what they could to counter Iran's efforts. I think not least because they are very worried themselves, of course, about the dangers of an escalating conflict in the region and doing what they can to dampen down any Iranian aggression.
So Iran sounds relatively isolated in the region. And given that so many of those drones and missiles were downed, will they see this as a successful mission, that mission accomplished? It seems that, as of now anyway, Iran is trying to sort of say, look, we're ready to draw a line under this. It was sort of tit for tat. This was the retaliation. And we're prepared to not do any more unless Israel attacks. But so there was a lot of posture in that, but who were they posturing for?
Well, certainly for domestic consumption, I think it's fair to say politics there is still fairly unstable and the economy is not in good shape. So I think anything where the Iranian government is able to present itself as taking on little Satan, as it calls Israel, that is good politics back home. But I think that the motivation for the Iranian attacks wasn't that. It was more to do with the fact they had to restore their deterrence. If sovereign territory is attacked in that part of the world and left unretaliated to, it's very bad for the strength of your deterrence. So I think that was the motivation behind what Iran did with these attacks. But obviously it helps them in terms of increasing political support back home.
And how does this feed into the domestic political picture in Israel? You obviously had a situation where Benjamin Netanyahu was coming under quite a lot of pressure from Western allies over what was going on in Gaza, the civilian loss of life, the death of the World Central Kitchen aid workers, and increasing pressure domestically as well. Does this change that? Does this change his standing as a politician?
I think it does to some extent. And I think, it's fair to point out that this has certainly changed the conversation, because until a few weeks ago, we were talking about Joe Biden so unhappy with the Israeli Prime Minister that he was openly talking about the possibility of reducing arms sales to Israel, and Joe Biden saying that Netanyahu was doing more harm than good to Israel. And then with the attack on the consulate and now this attack on Israel, we're not talking about that anymore. So I think it'd be too cynical to say that the attack happened because of that, but it certainly has changed the dynamics politically. But I think that's temporary, because I think that the fundamental problem with Netanyahu is his prescription for dealing with the threat of Hamas and also Hezbollah has been proven to be flawed. And that was managing it, in some ways strengthening Hamas, dividing and rule the Palestinians, so that you could kind of mow the grass every few years, is a rather cynical term that's used in Israel, which is sort of allow that threat to get strong enough to then require Israeli military to go in and crush it. And what we heard time and time again in the weeks after the attack, where we were out in Israel, were people saying that hasn't worked. It has failed. Hamas has got to be wiped out once and for all. And I don't think there's an alternative that's been found yet. And I think the difficulty for Netanyahu is he is inextricably linked with that period and therefore blamed by many people in Israel for what happened on October the 7th. Obviously, Hamas carried it out, but the conditions whereby that happened, the blame, I think, is laid very much at his door by many Israelis. And I don't think what's happening now is going to change that. So temporarily, his fortunes may have been strengthened to some extent, but I think long term, he's still in great trouble politically.
Well, no doubt this will dominate discussions internationally in the days ahead. I think here in the UK and in Westminster, you've got MPs coming back to the Commons tomorrow. And whilst Labour, the main opposition party, has been broadly supportive of the UK government's involvements in various aspects of what's going on in the Middle East, I imagine there'll be pressure for Rishi Sunak to come to the Commons tomorrow and explain what next. Thanks, Dominic. That's it for today. The Daily will be back with another episode at 5 p.m. tomorrow.